United States, 1917. A German torpedo rips through the hull of an American cargo ship in the middle of the Atlantic. An explosion follows. Metal screams. The lights go out. Desperation travels through an SOS signal over a black, hostile sea. Unrestricted submarine warfare has turned American ships into direct targets. On land, another shock hits. Secret information reaches the front pages of newspapers. A telegram promises Mexico the return of lost southwestern territories in exchange for joining Germany in a war against Uncle Sam. Banks, ports, and public opinion suddenly fall into line. From that moment on, neutrality becomes a fantasy. Every sunken ship and every line of that encrypted message pushes Washington closer to the front. This is how World War I began for the United States. A story that almost never happened. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, the United States watched from afar. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed neutrality, insisting that America must be impartial in thought as well as in action. This stance echoed a long-standing tradition rooted in the Monroe Doctrine and a deep aversion to European entanglements. But neutrality, as it turned out, was far easier to declare than to maintain. Germany's invasion of Belgium flooded American newspapers with reports of razed villages, executed civilians, and brutal repression. These stories forged the image of the barbaric German and slowly shifted public sympathy toward the Allies. Even so, Washington resisted. Wilson did not want a war that would bleed the nation dry.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had from the very beginning an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
One of Wilson's greatest concerns was the potential collapse of a booming American economy. By then, the United States had become a financial bridge to Europe. American banks and corporations were lending vast sums of money and shipping supplies to Britain and France. But the trade balance tilted so sharply that neutrality became an ambiguous word. The United States was not fighting, yet it was financing the Allied war effort, and Germany knew it.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Despite clinging to neutrality as a shield, the United States began to feel the war closing in. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. It was the first major shock to U.S. public opinion. Headlines demanded retaliation. Wilson, still determined to stay out of the conflict, demanded an apology and compensation. Berlin partially complied, fearing that pushing Washington too far would drive it straight into London's arms. For a time, diplomacy preserved the illusion of neutrality. Beneath the surface, however, economic ties continued to deepen. American banks were extending massive loans to the Allies.
U.S. arms sales to Europe increased from $6 million in 1914 to $500 million in 1917, almost all to the Allies. Newspapers often featured negative images of an aggressive, militaristic Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm, and emphasized the idea that democratic Britain and France were fighting against autocratic Germany and Austria.
By early 1917, there was no longer any doubt. Commercial interests, loans, ships, and even the dead were no longer just European. Many were American. It was only a matter of time before neutrality collapsed. Germany, worn down by the British blockade and the stalemate on the Western Front, made a desperate decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare.
Unrestricted submarine war meant sinking any ship in the designated zone around the British Isles and in the Mediterranean without any warning. contrary to the rules of warfare, and a practice the Germans had abandoned in 1915 because it threatened to drag the US into the war.
The spark that ignited the shift was not a single event, but a chain reaction. Berlin's announcement that any ship bound for Allied ports could be attacked marked the point of no return. In Washington, it was perceived as a direct challenge. But what truly tipped the national mood was the infamous Zimmermann telegram. Intercepted by British intelligence and published on March 1, 1917, it revealed a stunning proposal. Germany offered Mexico the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined the war against the United States.
The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram. Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary.
The revelation was political dynamite. The German proposal was widely seen as a betrayal of continental peace. Indignation became a weapon. Newspapers demanded honor in the face of blackmail, and Congress, pressed by bankers, industrialists, and a public now calling for action, began debating what only weeks earlier had seemed unthinkable. Between February and March, several American cargo ships were sunk: the Housatonic, the Algonquin, and the city of Memphis. Each sinking was a de facto declaration of war. Wilson, re-elected under the slogan, "He kept us out of war," realized that neutrality was no longer sustainable. On April 2, 1917, he addressed Congress. The world must be made safe for democracy.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
4 days later, on April 6th, the United States declared war on Germany. It was not a burst of patriotic fervor, but a calculated political and economic decision. Washington sought to protect financial and commercial interests tied to an Allied victory and to respond to a direct threat against its sovereignty. Germany gambled that its submarine campaign would break Britain before American troops could reach the front. It was wrong. In June, the first U.S. soldiers landed in Europe. With them came not only fresh manpower, but a moral boost that tipped the balance of the war.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
In less than 6 months, the nation that had sworn to stay out of the conflict became its decisive factor. Neutrality had surrendered to the torpedo and the telegram. Now imagine for a moment that Wilson had held firm and kept the United States out of the war. Without American intervention, the balance of power in 1917 would have looked very different, and perhaps the entire 20th century would have followed another path. Germany would have continued its unrestricted submarine campaign, aiming to cripple British trade before the Allies could recover. Without millions of tons of American supplies and massive loans, Britain might have faced economic collapse within months. Its population depended on Canadian wheat and American corn, and its merchant fleet was already stretched to the limit. France, with an exhausted army, could barely hold the front. Allied morale was faltering. Germany, though also starving under the blockade, would have had more room to maneuver. It could have concentrated greater forces in the West without fearing the arrival of American divisions. The Great Spring Offensive of 1918 might have reached Paris or at least forced favorable negotiations. Instead of total defeat, Berlin might have secured a balanced armistice, avoiding the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles. That treaty, after all, was shaped in large part by American presence at the negotiating table. Without Washington, France and Britain would have lacked the economic leverage to impose massive reparations. The result might have been a more pragmatic peace, perhaps less punitive, but also less stable, with no single power acting as global arbiter. The world's financial map would have shifted as well. The United States would not have transformed from debtor to creditor in 1918, nor become Europe's main source of reconstruction credit. American economic hegemony would have taken another decade or two to consolidate. Europe, still dominant in banking and trade, would have tried to rebuild without relying on the dollar. From a distance, the 20th century might have unfolded differently. Without Germany's collapse in 1918, the resentment that fueled Nazism might never have taken root. Without Versailles-era debt and inflation, the Weimar Republic might have had breathing room. Europe, instead, could have endured a slow imperial decline, while the United States remained what it was in 1914, a vast economic power reluctant to cross the Atlantic. But none of that happened. Despite nearly staying out, Washington became the central protagonist.
When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that the Allies needed desperately.
When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe lay in ruins. 4 empires had vanished: German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. From their collapse emerged new nations: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The 19th century order of monarchies and colonial balances had evaporated, and while Europe counted its dead, the United States rose. During the war, Washington had shifted from chronic debtor to the world's largest creditor. The Allies owed more than $10 billion, and American steel, oil, arms, and agricultural industries had expanded to sustain the conflict. After the war, U.S. capital flowed into European reconstruction, shaping policies and economies. The dollar slowly replaced the pound sterling as the world's financial benchmark. Yet this new economic power did not immediately translate into political dominance. At the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Wilson presented his 14 points and the vision of a League of Nations to preserve collective peace. But the U.S. Congress refused to ratify the treaty. The nation that had helped decide the war withdrew from diplomacy, retreating once more into isolationism. It was the great paradox of the new century, a global power unwilling to fully accept its role. Europe, meanwhile, remained trapped in debt and distrust. German reparations depended on American credit, which in turn allowed the Allies to repay Washington. The system worked until it didn't. When credit dried up in 1929, the entire financial structure collapsed. The 1920s became a pause between wars. The United States expanded its investments into Latin America and the Pacific, consolidating its sphere of influence. London remained a financial hub, but weakened. Paris searched for stability among ruins. Berlin survived on foreign loans. The new world map now had a financial center in New York and a heavily indebted Europe on its periphery. Thus, the end of World War I did more than redraw borders. It shifted the axis of economic power from the old world to the new. Europe retained its past. The United States became the future. In the end, the nation that almost stayed out of the war, guided by non-intervention, geographic distance, and political calculation, could not withstand sunken ships, secret telegrams, and bank balances that ultimately realigned its compass. This is where we reach the end. If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to join us in our next episode.